A mundane grocery store trip quickly escalates into an extraordinary confrontation that leaves everyone in its wake reeling. When a seasoned rapper like Snoop Dogg faces a disparaging comment from an elderly woman urging him to go back to Africa, his measured and thought-provoking response isn't just a comeback. It's a seismic cultural reckoning that reverberates far beyond the aisles. This isn't simply a story, it's a moment that transforms into a lesson on identity, history, and humanity. On a sunny afternoon in the heart of Compton, California, a grocery store bustled with the ordinary rhythm of life. Shoppers meandered through the aisles, their carts filled with the daily necessities of modern living. The soft hum of conversations mingled with the clatter of items being stacked, creating a familiar soundtrack of routine. Among the crowd was a young mother guiding her toddler, a retiree choosing vegetables with care, and a store employee efficiently restocking shelves. It was within this everyday scene that an encounter unfolded, one destined to disrupt the mundanity of the day. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who appeared to be in her late 70s, was standing by the produce section. Her short silver hair was neatly pinned in place and her attire, a faded cardigan layered over a floral blouse, gave her an unassuming presence. Adjusting her glasses, she muttered softly to herself while selecting a bag of apples. Her mannerisms hinted at a certain impatience, but the day had yet to hint at the confrontation that was about to erupt. Not far from Mrs. Thompson stood Snoop Dogg, a figure instantly recognizable for his laid-back charisma and iconic style. Dressed in a signature Compton hoodie and jeans, Snoop balanced a basket of groceries in one hand and his phone in the other, his calm demeanor blending seamlessly into the store's flow. He appeared deep in thought, his attention on the screen in front of him as he reached toward a nearby bag of oranges. But then, without warning, the tranquility of the moment shattered. Mrs. Thompson turned abruptly, her attention catching on Snoop's presence. Her expression shifted with palpable disapproval, eyes narrowed, lips pressed tightly together. Her voice, though not loud, carried an unsettling weight that pierced the air. "You people don't belong here," she declared, her tone sharp and deliberate. A stunned hush followed her words, the store's casual rhythm faltering under their impact. Shoppers within earshot froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Some tried to act as though they hadn't heard, others hovered awkwardly, their curiosity piqued against their better judgment. Snoop's initial reaction was one of visible surprise. His fingers paused mid-text, his gaze lifting to meet hers. As her words sank in, a subtle frown creased his forehead, a fleeting expression of both disbelief and contemplation. Yet he didn't react impulsively. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as if allowing himself the necessary space to fully grasp the weight of what had just been said. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. Her voice rose again, this time louder, more resolute. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" Her words ricocheted through the store like an unwelcome echo, the tension in the room now tangible. A young employee paused while stacking bananas nearby, unsure whether to intervene or remain uninvolved. A cashier at the register craned her neck for a better view, the curiosity of bystanders unmistakable. For a moment, Snoop was silent, his hand still gripping the basket handle. All eyes were on him now. The crowd, equal parts transfixed and unnerved, awaited his response with bated breath. Mrs. Thompson remained rigid, clutching her apples tightly as though unwilling to yield an inch of ground. Her chin was raised defiantly, her posture daring him to challenge her. And Snoop did respond, but not in the way anyone expected. His reply wasn't rushed, nor was it raised in anger. Instead, it was calm, deliberate, and unyielding in its composure. "Ma'am," he began, his tone steady and deliberate. "Do you even realize what you've just said?" The question hung in the air like an invitation for reflection, but Mrs. Thompson's reply came swiftly, void of introspection. "I said what I said," she retorted, her voice cutting. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." With those words, the stage was set for what would become an unforgettable moment. Yet Snoop, unwavering in his demeanor, refused to be provoked. Instead, he nodded slowly, the weight of her statement reflected not in anger but in resolve. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Since you brought it up, let's talk about that." What followed wasn't an argument. It wasn't a confrontation laced with shouting or insults. Instead, it was a history lesson, a powerful, sobering account of the painful legacy borne by generations before him. With each word, Snoop painted a vivid picture, not just for Mrs. Thompson but for everyone standing within earshot. "My great-great-grandfather was born right here in California," he explained, his voice unwavering. "Before that, my ancestors were brought here against their will. They endured hardship beyond imagination, forced to labor like animals to build the very foundations of this state, this country that you call yours. The gravity of his words began to sink in. Mrs. Thompson's defiance wavered ever so slightly, though she remained silent. Around them, the store was eerily still, the chatter of the crowd now entirely replaced by Snoop's poignant narration. As he spoke, his calmness took on a commanding presence, drawing every listener closer. What had started as a clash of words became something much greater, a moment of cultural reckoning that resonated deeply with those witnessing it. Through his dignified response, Snoop turned an incident of prejudice into an opportunity for dialogue, empowering everyone present to question their own assumptions and biases. As Snoop Dogg stood before the crowd in the grocery store, his voice grew stronger, weaving the threads of his family's history into a tapestry of resilience, sacrifice, and belief in a nation's promise, even when it faltered in delivering that promise. His words carried a rare power, not born of anger but of conviction, dignity, and truth. My grandfather, he began, his tone unwavering, fought in Korea for a country that sent him to war but wouldn't grant him equal rights when he came back home. He couldn't sit at the same lunch counters. He wasn't allowed to drink from the same fountains as others. Yet he stayed. He endured. You know why? Snoop paused, letting the crowd feel the weight of his question. Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him. The grocery store seemed to hold its breath. The faint hum of the refrigerators grew quieter, as if even the appliances were listening. And my parents, Snoop continued, his voice softening yet maintaining its intensity. They fought too, not with guns, not with fists, but with their lives by simply being who they are. They raised me to respect everyone no matter what they looked like. My mother dedicated her entire life as a teacher, instilling love and equality into the hearts of children from every background. My father, he's the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to pull over on the side of the road to help someone like you, Mrs. Thompson, if your car broke down. Snoop paused again, letting his words settle like drops of rain on dry soil. His eyes never wavered from Mrs. Thompson's face, though she appeared visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag of apples. So, he said finally, his voice tinged with quiet sadness, you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa? He shook his head gently, his gaze unwavering. Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family paid the price for it in blood, sweat, and tears. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed deeply, her lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but her words faltered, catching in her throat. Her defiance cracked under the weight of Snoop's truth. Snoop took a step back, his posture as composed as ever. Addressing the gathering crowd, his voice rang out with clarity, I could have walked away. I could have ignored this. But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us, to be better than this. To rise above words like those. For a moment, the silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Mrs. Thompson's face became a tumult of emotions. Anger, embarrassment, and something deeper. Shame. Then, breaking the stillness, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap stepped forward. He's right, the man Derek said, his voice low but firm. We've got to be better than this. The spell broke. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle spoke next. My dad fought in that same war, Mrs. Garcia whispered, her voice trembling. He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. The murmurs began to swell, a shift in the atmosphere that transformed the tension into a collective reflection. A young cashier named Ava called out from her station, her voice filled with admiration. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you. Mrs. Thompson glanced around the crowd, her expression flustered and uncertain. She clutched her cart tighter, searching for words, but they never came. She wheeled her cart toward the exit, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the confrontation had stripped her of the fire she had started with. As she left, the applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling into a resonant wave of appreciation. People clapped not just for Snoop's bravery and eloquence, but for the message he had delivered, a call to confront ignorance with dignity. A woman approached Snoop, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you, Tanya said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. Snoop smiled faintly, lifting his basket. Sometimes, he murmured almost to himself, it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth. The crowd gradually dispersed, but the store felt different now, quieter, more contemplative. Snoop finished his shopping, his steps measured as though he was carrying the weight of the moment. At the checkout line, Ava scanned his items with a shy smile. "What you said back there," she hesitated before continuing, "it meant a lot." "Grace," Snoop replied warmly, "is the only way to break through anger. Anything else just builds walls." As he stepped into the parking lot, the setting sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. He noticed Mrs. Thompson sitting in her car, gripping the steering wheel. For a fleeting moment, he considered approaching her, but decided against it. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later, at his home in Compton, Snoop recounted the day's events to his crew. His friend Leroy nodded. "You did the right thing," Leroy said. "Not just for yourself but for everyone watching. People like her, they don't change overnight. But you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow." Across town, Mrs. Thompson sat at her dining table, staring at her untouched meal. Snoop's words replayed in her mind, each one a chisel carving away at the armor of her assumptions. For the first time she felt the sting of doubt. In the days that followed, the story of the grocery store confrontation spread throughout the community. It became more than just a moment, it became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the courage to stand up for truth. Strangers approached Snoop to share their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His actions had sparked conversations that were long overdue. Even Mrs. Thompson began to change. Though subtle and slow, her transformation was undeniable. While she hadn't sought Snoop out to apologize, she hoped that someday she'd have the courage to do so. Moments like these remind us that strength isn't always about speaking the loudest. It's about speaking with conviction, dignity, and calm. They teach us that truth, when spoken with grace, has the power to heal, unite, and inspire us to be better.